Ambassador.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador?
Well, first, welcome very much, Ambassador Branstad. We are delighted to have you, and thank you for your friendship with Kraneshares and your willingness to be out here in San Francisco with us to talk about, I know your favorite subject, U.S. China relations. So thanks for being here.
Well, I want to thank John for the very nice introduction and congratulate Kraneshares on your long-term relationship and your success in China. It's a challenging place, but it's very important. Second biggest economy in the world. They have now more people in their middle class than we have the entire population of America.
Amazing. So global investors, of course, are very interested in China's posture with regard to international relations and what's going on with China's domestic economy. But if you'll indulge me, especially because of your relationship with President Xi, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about Chinese politics. This fall, in October, it'll be the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. All expectations are that President Xi Jinping will be elected to a third consecutive 5-year term. I'm going to assume you agree that is the likely outcome from the meeting in October. And I'm just very interested in your take on how he's thinking about that and sort of how he's thinking about what will be the next 5-year plan. And I know everyone's interested in your personal insights into President Xi.
Well, first of all, I think it's a sure bet that he will be elected to a third 5-year term. Of course, he's thought well ahead on this. He's pretty much eliminated all the rivals. So there's nobody really on the horizon that is a really significant challenger. And I think he's a very astute leader. He's done things to gain the support of the people of China. Of course, one of the big things, of course, the Communist Party, their number one goal is to maintain power and to identify any potential threats and make sure they're eliminated. And he wants to have a very smooth situation going into this party Congress, which comes in October or November. I haven't set the date yet, but I don't think there's any doubt that Xi Jinping will be the leader. Under Deng Xiaoping and his successors, after the experience they had with Mao, they decided to have term limits. But remember, there's only term limits on the president of China. Xi Jinping has 3 titles: General Secretary of the Communist Party, Commander-in-Chief of the People's Liberation Army, and President of China. President of China is the weakest of the 3. And so that's the only one they had term limits, and they eliminated that. And so there's a lot of people think that he will not only serve another 5 years, but it may be beyond that. And certainly I think he's in a position to do that. He has a very clear vision of where he wants China to be the undisputed world leader, economically, politically, militarily, and he is well on the road to doing that. He's got the Belt and Road Initiative and many other things going for him. Now, the big unknown situation is, what has this COVID virus thing done? Initially, it started in Wuhan, China, but the Chinese were very confident that their zero tolerance had worked and they'd been able to really stamp it out. Well, now you got Shanghai basically closed down, and I have a daughter that's teaching at the international school in Beijing. They're very concerned it could happen in Beijing as well. And so that's the big unknown that could disrupt things. And then the other thing, of course, is what's going on in Ukraine. And there's a lot of concern about that and what China's going to do as far as whether they do more to help the Russians or whether they try to play both sides.
Well, let's if you don't mind, let's slow down and talk about those 2 issues, because that is what President Xi faces as he will enter his third 5-year term. With hundreds of millions of people, by most estimates, locked down in China, he's sort of got to deal with this issue very directly. And commentators have speculated that maybe one of the challenges in China has been, with regard to effectiveness of the Chinese vaccines and as compared to the effectiveness of the Western vaccines. Obviously, the policies seem to be going in different directions. China is further restricting, whereas the United States and Europe is sort of opening up some of those restrictions. What's your take? Is President Xi likely to make an adjustment, make a change? Do you think there'll be a change in the vaccination program? How are they thinking about the response to COVID?
Well, first of all, the way things work in China, nothing happens until Xi Jinping decides, and then everybody falls in line. That's what happened in Wuhan. Initially we were all told, oh, we've got things under control, no problem. Then all of a sudden they realized it was not under control. People at the local level were lying to them because they knew what would happen to them if the truth got out. And of course, we know what happened to them. They're gone. The mayor, the leader of Hubei province, and all of that sort of stuff. But then, with their virtually no tolerance policy, it looked like they had been very successful and had handled it better than other countries. Now it's going the other way. So whether they change or not, that's a good question. But this zero tolerance policy with 1.4 billion people is hard to manage.
For sure.
And
for sure.
So I think that's the biggest unknown and the biggest challenge that Xi Jinping is facing between now and October, November.
Yeah. And you also mentioned the other challenge that's on the front page of all of the world's newspapers, and that is war in Eastern Europe. Now, there was a lot of hand-wringing and speculation over the meeting on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics between President Putin and President Xi, and what sort of China's posture is going to be going forward. We're now 2 months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and there does seem to be some adjustment to Chinese policies and the Chinese posture with regard to Russia. I'm very interested in your take as to what lessons or what interpretation President Xi may be making in light of the pretty severe sanctions being brought down on Russia, the apparent unification of NATO and Europe, along with Russia's difficulties on the battlefield in Ukraine. How are they viewing it in China?
I think Russia and the whole world underestimated Zelensky and what a leader that he would become on this thing. He has done something that is unique. He's united the Ukrainians, he's united the rest of the world, and he's been able to appeal to parliaments throughout the world on a humanitarian basis of what Russia is doing is just war crimes and attacking women and children and hospitals and all the brutality. And people are seeing this every day in the media and social media. And consequently, Zelensky is, I think, the Winston Churchill of our day. And the result is, I think America and I think the NATO and even other countries like Sweden and Finland that never wanted to be in NATO before are already saying, yeah, we want to join NATO. So it's made that alliance much stronger. Unfortunately, we got in it late. We didn't show strength early. And I think the result is going to be, it's going to be a long and bloody battle. But at this point, it looks like the rest of the world is lining up against them. And I think China's got to be very careful, because if they do support Russia militarily, they could have secondary sanctions against them. And they have a much bigger economy, and it could be much more harmful to them than Russia.
And the indications are that Chinese firms and the Chinese government has every intention of complying with the international sanctions, which some have suggested might be a recognition of the difficulties Russia's having, and
Right.
China trying to get out in front of what will be the likely result for Russia. But I want to, quickly ask you to just follow up a little bit on this comment about how Beijing might be thinking about sort of the performance of the European alliance and sort of America's ability to lead on these sanctions issue. Do you think that may ultimately take some of the pressure out of U.S.-China relations?
Well, remember, the Chinese people are being fed the same lie that the Russian people are. This was all caused by NATO, not by Putin, which, that is, I think, pretty unbelievable, because NATO was unprepared, but NATO has been motivated by Zelensky and has now gotten engaged. But the truth is, they weren't prepared, and now they're paying a real price for it. But I think China is realizing that these sanctions against Russia are pretty significant. Now, China is in one way a beneficiary of it, because they get oil and natural gas from Russia and whatever. But, if you look back at the history, Russia and China have had a kind of a love-hate relationship over decades, maybe centuries.
Yeah, and this idea that there's going to be a sort of return of some sort of Sino-Soviet or Sino-Russian alliance seems to be, fading now after 2 months of Russia's difficulties on the battlefield. But it's a very interesting point you make about China, perhaps as an unintended consequence being a beneficiary of the international sanctions. And I think that's a good segue to talk a little bit about your take on what's going on with the Chinese economy. And let's, stay with President Xi. You're a friend now for a couple of decades.
He calls me an old friend because we treated him so well when he came to Iowa in 1985. And we did that because I had gone to China in '84 and been treated so well there. We wanted to show him the Iowa friendliness and hospitality. As a result, I became known as an old friend. Our sister state relationship has been active over all this time. We just hosted the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Qinggong, in Iowa last week. And it's not very friendly for him in Washington, D.C. right now from either party, but he got a very warm reception in Iowa, and we were honored to be able to host him. He was at the World Food Prize building. He went to Muscatine, where we had the Old Friends reunion, where Xi Jinping stayed with the Dvorak family. He visited the Kimberly farm, and in fact, he did something that Xi Jinping didn't do. Xi Jinping got in the tractor with Rick Kimberly, but I said this at the luncheon that we hosted with Qinggong. He actually drove the tractor.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you'll continue
further.
We all hope you'll continue to show that kind of hospitality. And your history with President Xi, I think, between you and former Secretary Kissinger, we have sort of the two individuals with the deepest and longest standing friendship with President Xi. Both, I would add, are friends of Kraneshares. We've hosted Dr. Kissinger at an event just like this one. Yeah.
Well, he's a remarkable individual, and I've always admired the leadership he provided. He was the one that really laid the groundwork for Nixon's visit and opening up China. And I've read his book, and I certainly admire all the things he's done. But, we are the two biggest economies. We recognized real early on China had a lot of potential as a trading partner, and we are the leading agriculture producing state. I know they raise some fruit and nuts here in California, but we in Iowa, corn, soybeans, pork, beef, chicken, we are a major producer. And China just can't raise enough food to feed itself. And with the growing middle class, they want more protein, and their top choice of protein is pork. And we are by far the leading pork producing state.
Well, let's talk about
that's something that's very important to us.
Yeah, let's talk about the trade relationship, because your time as U.S. ambassador coincided, frankly, with an era with, a time when there was increasing pressure, some might even say a confrontation between Washington and Beijing over trade issues.
And no question, it was a very stressful, challenging time as far as trade is concerned.
And there you were, a former governor of Iowa, and our man in Beijing at a time when the president was sort of prosecuting this, through tariffs on trade of mostly goods, but even some services. Maybe you can share with us some of your insight, how that felt, and if you don't mind, with the benefit of hindsight, how do you think that's come out? Because we seem to be entering a time when there's some easing of some of that pressure. Slowly but surely, the Biden administration seems to be exempting products from those tariffs.
Well, I think the tariffs were instrumental in getting the Chinese attention that we weren't going to take it anymore. For years, they had promised. We helped them get in the World Trade Organization 2001, and they kept saying, we're going to open up, we're going to liberalize, we're going to do all this stuff. And they kept putting it off and putting it off. And then they'd have these dialogues that led to nothing. The Trump administration said, we want results, we want reciprocity in trade, and if we don't get it, we're going to put tariffs on. Of course, they did. We knew what would happen. The Chinese would retaliate, and they would retaliate against agriculture, which is, of course, something near and dear to my heart.
Sure.
And they did, but the administration provided subsidies and helped farmers kind of through that stressful time. And I think Iowa farmers, I think most American farmers realized we couldn't continue the way it had been through several previous administrations. We had to insist on fairness and reciprocity. And I gained a lot of respect for Robert Lighthizer, the lead negotiator. He and Mnuchin were the lead on the American side. The Chinese lead negotiator was Liu He. I gained a great deal of respect for him as well. They worked together over a 2-year period. It looked like it was all going to come together, and then the hardliners, I think, got to Xi Jinping and said, we're going too far, we can't eliminate these subsidies of the state-owned enterprises. And so that got taken off the table, but it came back and we got the Phase 1 trade agreement. And since that time, been record purchases of corn, soybeans, corn especially. They'd purchased a lot of soybeans before. And then with the African swine fever, they're purchasing a lot of pork. But now it's corn, pork, soybeans, and even beef and some chicken. So that's made a real difference. Now, they haven't done as much in energy. They are doing some things in the financial services area. Recently, they finally gave the approval to the Principal Financial Group, which is headquartered in Des Moines, they have the leading 401k product in the world to be able to market that in China. So I think despite the tensions and the issues we have between our two countries, the Chinese people recognize the safety, the quality, and the reliability of American food, and I think that's going to continue to be an important thing for us. And many of these agriculture organizations have, over a long period of time, built lasting friendships with the customers in China. And so those long-term relationships are real important.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I think it goes to this distinction between the strategic competition between the United States and China and sort of the Cold War, of 50 years ago, where the United States and the Soviets had two separate systems competing against each other. And today we have two strong economies competing within a single system. Oftentimes it's put in terms of interdependence or interconnectivity. And I know there are going to be some questions about the trade policy, especially your experience. We have people in the room here in San Francisco, but we have many hundreds of people who are participating remotely. And I want to remind those people that they can submit those questions at info@Kraneshares.com. And hopefully we'll be able to get to those before the conclusion of our session. Moving on from trade, though, Ambassador, let's talk about capital flows a little bit, because again, beginning with your time as ambassador, during your time as ambassador, Washington became sort of increasingly concerned about Chinese investment in the United States.
Yeah,
And
changing the CFIUS law.
Right.
And then had strong bipartisan support.
Right, yeah, right. Across Congress, there was a sort of additional restrictions on the CFIUS review process, which is very interesting for Chinese capital flows to the United States, especially private equity flows. But here at Kraneshares, we're especially interested in getting your take on public equity markets and some of the changes in Washington and some of the back and forth with regard to accounting transparency. I know it's an area that you have some personal professional experience, and I'd love to have your thoughts on sort of where we stand with regard to the PCAOB and accounting transparency and sort of this whole issue around talk about delisting from U.S. exchanges.
Well, I was a public member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants Board when the PCAOB came into existence. And I met with the PCAOB before I went to China as the ambassador. And I know that they're insisting on having transparency, and investors are entitled to that. And it's not just with China, it's with companies from anywhere. The good news, I think, is I think there's a deadline in 2024 that they have to comply with. But in the meantime, and Liu He, I think, within a last month or so, had a speech and said, we intend to see these things worked out. Barry Malasan is a very good friend of mine, head of the AICPA. I know they're working on it. And so I'm optimistic they're going to get this worked out. There may be some delistings of companies that won't comply or don't comply. The Chinese like to say, well, it's a national security matter. But I don't think that's the case. And American investors are entitled to transparency. Sure. And I think we're going to see this get worked out. I'm very hopeful that it will be. I would also say about the Chinese economy, Xi Jinping loves to say, we're a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. Hell, they're not a socialist country. They haven't been a socialist country for a long time. They're an authoritarian country with capitalist intentions. And they're very capitalistic. They're very entrepreneurial. The Chinese people are. They still like to say they're socialist, but that's not the case.
Well, maybe that's a great time to ask you about sort of this idea of common prosperity.
Yeah.
And something President Xi has been talking about for better than a year now, and sort of how does that translate into this incredibly dynamic, fast-growing, despite COVID and other issues, Chinese domestic economy?
Well, first of all, there is disparity in China. If you go to Beijing, where I was posted, and I went to, I'm a Catholic, I went to Mass at the Canadian Embassy. On the way there, I'd go by 3 dealerships, Lamborghini, Rolls-Royce, and Bentley. We don't have a lot of those in Des Moines, Iowa. So I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of wealth in places like Beijing and Shanghai, Guangzhou, those coastal cities. I've been out in the countryside, though, too. And I've been to some relatively poor villages in China. So they still have a long way to go. 1.4 billion people, a huge country, and there is significant disparity. Xi Jinping has made that a goal, and he's made a real effort to try to increase the income of the people in these rural areas. But they do have, in my opinion, a long way to go on that. And they make it sound like, oh, gosh, we've eliminated poverty altogether. Well, depends by whose standard you're measuring it.
Yeah, and China certainly doesn't have a sole proprietorship on income inequality,
no.
As you know. But sort of how to address that, I think, is very interesting, because there seems to be a redoubling. Well, they've been very explicit about making China more of a consumer economy and promoting Chinese consumerism. I'm sure he didn't have, Bentleys and Lamborghinis in mind when he said that, but how should we think about this government policy, this deliberate really structural effort to make China and Chinese people sort of stronger consumers, not just increasing their purchasing power, but creating more of a culture of consumerism?
They're making progress on that, but again, I would say they have a long way to go. And many people living in these rural villages are very concerned because if they have a health problem, to a great degree, they've got to pay for that themselves. And even if the children are working in a factory in the coast, the grandchildren, their children are probably living with their grandparents in rural China. And so there is a big disparity there in a lot of those people because they've lived through the Great Leap Forward when somewhere between 25 and 40 million people starved to death. The Cultural Revolution, when they closed the colleges and universities, sent them out to work for the peasants. And so, you know, that's not that long ago that they're very fearful of, and you know, what's happened with throughout the history of China, they always had these dynasties and strong emperors, but then if they had a famine or something like that, that dynasty might be overthrown and replaced by another one. And in the minds of a lot of Chinese people, Xi Jinping is the latest emperor. And they look at the emperor as somebody that, blessed by heaven, can do no wrong. And so that's kind of the situation. And China has had substantial growth, but it's slowing down. And the impact of COVID may make it even worse. Right now, when you have places like Shanghai closed down, you know, that's probably the biggest seaport in the world and a huge commercial center. And so obviously that could and will have, I think, some impact. Now, traditionally what they do, they'll pour a bunch of money into infrastructure projects to try to make the economy stronger.
Yeah, and so, you know, stimulating the economy coming out of COVID, not unlike, you know, what Europeans and what Washington has done for the United States. Another way of kind of addressing some of these inequality issues and balancing China's economy has been President Xi's emphasis on technology and development of technology and manufacturing in China. I'm wondering if, you know, your sources that I know you maintain, as well as from your time running the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, they have something called China 2025, and that is their goals to be the world leader in a lot of these emerging technologies. And they are working on that diligently. They're investing a lot of money in that. I think it's kind of more inspirational than totally something that's going to be accomplished by 2025. But no doubt, they want to be self-sufficient and they want to be the world leader. And that's something that obviously concerns American technology companies and Taiwan, which is a leader in semiconductors as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Taiwan. We couldn't have a conversation with you without sort of, you know, going to this issue of cross-straits relations. You know, so many investors and commentators have, you know, tried to think about Ukraine and Europe and U.S. sanctions and sort of what this all means for cross-straits relations. It's especially, I think, interesting to consider it in light of technology, because of, you know, what has been, you know, so impressive from Taipei and sort of development, especially on, you know, semiconductors and that part of the global economy. You know, maybe you can talk about how you think President Xi is thinking about cross-straits relations and where we can, you know, what we should be looking at for an indication of where the relationship is going.
There's no doubt that Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear that he wants Taiwan under the control of mainland China sometime while he is the leader. You know, that's kind of the last thing that he wants to accomplish. You know, they've done it now with Hong Kong. He wants to do it there. Now, the people in Taiwan are fearful of this because they saw what happened in Hong Kong, supposedly one country, two systems, but they've lost their freedom of speech and assembly, independent judiciary, and all of that stuff. And so they don't really want that. And I don't think that Xi Jinping, he wants Taiwan, but he doesn't want to destroy all the infrastructure that's there to get it. So how is he going to do that? And, you know, the Chinese take kind of the long view of things. Some people thought with what's happening in Ukraine, they would move up the timetable that they would move on Taiwan. There might be some second thoughts about that as well. But I think China will not move on Taiwan until they feel they have extraordinary, overwhelming military superiority. Of course, they've been building up the South China Sea. They've been building their Navy. And so a lot of people feel it's just a matter of time. How much time? It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, one interpretation is with regard to cross-straits relations, you know, it seems as though we are in an era that more closely resembles, you know, biding your time and hiding your light, that Xi Jinping and leaders in Beijing seem to be quite satisfied with the trajectory with regard to Taiwan. There's no de jure declaration of independence, for example, and that sort of the slow integration of Taiwan may actually give life to the sort of, you know, one country, two interpretations that has been the pronouncement out of Beijing. And it's interesting to hear you say, while that is his goal, that, you know, China time may be, you know, a long time with regard to Taiwan relations. And I think it's especially important to consider in light of the sort of Ukraine-Russia lens, the cost of not necessarily invading and taking Taiwan, but occupying Taiwan. And is that a cost that anyone in Beijing would be willing to pay, and the potential disruption of China's ascent?
Well, and I think China is going to kind of evaluate the impact. It's just like with the fall of the Soviet Union, they spent a lot of time evaluating what went wrong with communism in the USSR and how could they prevent that from happening in China. And they made substantial adjustments and looked at ways they could strengthen the Communist Party at the local level and be in a position that they would not be faced with what happened there.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's interesting because you've I think already speculated that there could be a fourth and maybe fifth-year term for President Xi, and you're in good company, I think, when you do that. But nonetheless, you know.
Well, remember, I had 6 terms in the government.
There you go.
So
maybe that's the source of the close friendship between the two of you. It's you know, I think it's very interesting to consider now entering what will be, you know, his 11th year as, you know, General Secretary and President and leader of China's military. He must be thinking about legacy, right? He's a young, vigorous leader, but he's a very vigorous leader, but nonetheless must be thinking about legacy. And I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about the idea of President Xi having a legacy of Chinese companies going global. You sort of opened up our discussion by saying ultimately his aspiration is for China to be a global leader.
Right.
And at Kraneshares, we spend a lot of time thinking about these Chinese companies that have sort of global opportunities.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, I think he truly has a vision. He wants China to be rich, powerful, and well-respected. And Chinese companies becoming world leaders, and certainly the Belt and Road Initiative is an example of where he's reaching out and building infrastructure in other parts of the world, not just in Asia, but in Africa, South America, Europe. So there's no question that he's got a grandiose vision of where he wants China to go. And of course, he wants Chinese companies to be successful, but he wants to make sure that they are loyal. And he has made sure that they have communist cells in all of these companies. And so, yes, he wants to see them be able to expand. He wants to see them play key roles in the United Nations and other places. But he also, among everything, wants loyalty to the Communist Party and wants to maintain control. And he wants to be the leader that is recognized, not just in China, but I think worldwide, as the one that brought China to the forefront as being the world leader.
And another, I guess, angle to this idea of bringing Chinese companies global and sort of the government influence would be government support, right? You know, we have the issue of state-linked companies or state-owned enterprises, but there are even companies that clearly are not state-owned enterprises, but nonetheless, you know, would receive the government's full-throated support in their global ambitions. I'm wondering if you've observed that, if that's consistent with your take on things.
Absolutely, and that's part of the China 2025 ambition. They want China in some of these new emerging technologies to be the world leader, and they're willing to subsidize and support these companies to be successful in doing that. So yes, I think there's no doubt about that.
And we're I suppose, you know, I served in the first term of the Obama administration, right. and sort of the hallmark of our China policy was cooperation first, right? That, of course, evolved by the second term, and by the time you entered the embassy in Beijing into competition or, you know, even at times confrontation. We now seem to be sort of settling into this idea of strategic competition between East and West, between the United States and China, leading to cooperation. That's that interdependent part of it. And I'm wondering sort of how you see sort of the Chinese government support for Chinese companies playing out in terms of this global competition that the Chinese companies are entering.
Well, I think when you get into national defense type issues or new technology issues, this is where the United States has said, wait a minute, we got to protect our interests. We can't have Chinese supposed students who are really employed by the PLA in our universities stealing our technology. So that's things that we've tried to really clamp down on and really review investments to make sure America's national security and interests in the technology of the future are protected. And so that's where I think a lot of the competition goes. But in some of the more traditional areas, consumer goods, obviously China makes quality, low-cost consumer goods, and we're very dependent on them. They're very dependent on us for safe, quality, and reliable supply of food products. And they really need LNG and other natural resources to reduce their dependency on coal, and we have a very abundant supply of LNG and things like that, and there's some real opportunities there that unfortunately I think have been missed here in the last year or so.
Sure, and does the trade deficit bother you? Because despite sort of, you know, all of the back and forth, you know, when I'm asked this question, I'll tell you what I do is I usually pull my iPhone out of my pocket.
Yeah.
And I say, this is a product, you know, this is an Apple Inc. Cupertino, California product that was assembled in China from, depending on which model you have, components from 43 or 48 different countries. And when it comes over, as they do every night, you know, in the big cargo aircraft, comes over from China to the United States to be sold here, it goes down for purposes of the trade statistics as an export from China.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in sort of your take on, you know, how China views that, whether that sort of role as, you know, sort of being so primary in the supply chain is something the Chinese are comfortable with, or whether you think U.S. policies have made, you know, China less comfortable with being so integrally intertwined in the American economy.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have the right answer to that. I just know that automobiles today, you have components from all over the world. whether it's a Japanese company or an American company or whatever, they've got component parts from all over. And so you know, happen to have a Lexus, which is a Japan, but it's got 230,000 miles on it. Very dependable, and it's a very, in my opinion, great car. But you know, it's a Japanese company, but
may not have been made in Japan, though.
no,
right?
that's right. A lot of them are made in America.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I think we can't get away from the fact it's now a world economy, and we have to protect our interests. But we also need to recognize that it's worldwide global competition. And if you have a quality product and your price is low, you know, you're in a very strong position. I think when you get into things like Huawei and the concern about the possibility that they could be using that to steal American secrets, then you have some problems. And that's the kind of the tougher issues that have to be dealt with between our two countries.
And it's great. I'm glad you brought that up. So, you know, so the Huawei experience was very much sort of ongoing during your time in the embassy. And, you know, the lessons, you know, that China might take from the Huawei experience and China's interest in making its telecoms or other technology companies global and providing reassurances to the West that there are not these sort of ulterior security-related motives. Do you think that's, do you think that's a lesson that China might take from the Huawei experience? And second, you know, does that sort of, how does that augur, I think, for, you know, taking some of the pressure out of the U.S.-China relations? Do you think the Huawei experience is instructive?
Well, I think what it says is America has come to the realization that we were too naive for too long, and as a result, we did have technology that was being stolen, and we had China using their opportunities here for their benefit to our detriment. And now I think with the changes we made in CFIUS and the other thing, but I think we've got to continue to be very vigilant. And I think in terms of our trade policy, we got to look in our relationship, fairness and reciprocity. The Chinese ambassador to the United States can pretty much go anywhere he wants to, meet with students, go to universities. I'd have to get permission from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, then from the Provincial Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then from the City Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at any level, they could decide at the last minute, it's not convenient for you to visit this facility. Well, that is not fair, and that's something that we tried to address. And then we also discovered that there were people that were here on visas. I'm all for visas of Chinese students, and we have literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese students that have studied in the United States. I think that's been a good thing. But in the critical technology fields where we've had examples of people stealing technology, we need to be very careful not to grant visas to those people.
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting. You brought up this idea of reciprocity and this question of intellectual property. And we're at the Kraneshares Innovation Conference this morning. And so I've always believed that, you know, China's interest in a strong intellectual property protection regime would come naturally as China continues to develop its own intellectual property capacity.
Yes.
And I know you witnessed that firsthand.
And I agree with that. And I think we're starting to see that happen, and that was part of the Phase 1 agreement, is more protection for intellectual property. But I think it does depend upon what province you're in. Some provinces have come a long ways and are being very fair on that. But remember, they don't have an independent judiciary. The Communist Party still chooses who the judges are, and consequently, it's not like America where we have an independent judiciary or most Western nations. And so that's one of the concerns. But they are making progress, and I think it's in China's interest to protect intellectual property, because as they're making progress on that, they don't want their intellectual property stolen by somebody else.
Well, Ambassador, I know there have been many questions submitted, and we only have a couple of minutes. I'm
Okay.
wondering if you'd be willing to take a
I'd love
question or
to.
two from the group in
Absolutely.
here. I think there may be a microphone going around. The lights are tough. I don't know if anyone here has one or one came in. I have plenty more, by the way.
We got somebody towards the back
Yeah.
there that's got their hand up.
Please. I don't know if there's a microphone.
They're getting a microphone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Ambassador, can you tell us, share with us, how far do you think the United States wants to escalate a Cold War with China? And also, how much do you think the United States wants to do business in the Chinese market? Thank you.
Did you hear?
Well, I don't think we really want a Cold War with China. We want to have fair competition, and we want to make sure that our companies and Americans are treated fairly in China, and we want them to be open to compete here as well, provided they follow the rules. And that's what I told. Xi Jinping wants China to be rich, powerful, and respected, but you can't be respected if you don't follow the rules that the rest of the world follows. So that's the key, I think, to maintaining a relationship, a competitive relationship. I think competition is good and it's healthy, but we also want to make sure that it's fair.
Yeah, I think we've seen increasingly, again, I'll pull the iPhone out
Yeah.
in response to a question like that sort of this idea in academia around a Thucydides trap and sort of this ultimate, grand confrontation, seems to not be in the interest of either the United States or China.
Right.
I know you're a realist, and most sort of foreign policy hands in the U.S. China relationship subscribe to realism and this idea that, well, values are important, but
Right.
interests are really what control that relationship. And that's where I think we get back to this idea that we have two strong competitors in a single system.
Right.
The United States with many companies that obviously are dominant globally, and China with aspirations for companies that will compete on a global scale. So, Ambassador, thank you very much for being here with us. We are, so delighted to have you as sort of part of our group. At a recent conference, we had your predecessor, Max Baucus, who sends his regards. I told him that you would be here, and we've had
He and his wife were very helpful to my wife and I when we were preparing to move to China. And you may not know this, but his wife used to be a prosecutor in Des Moines, Iowa.
I did know that. I did know that, and she's terrific.
Yes, she is.
American diplomacy is about passing batons.
Yeah.
And it's that type of a relay race. It goes over time and over political changes in Washington, D.C., but nonetheless, I think especially with regard to U.S. China relations, whether it's Dr. Kissinger, who also is a friend of Kraneshares and has participated and will be participating in an upcoming Kraneshares conference, or Ambassador Baucus, or you, we are very proud of the work you've done to advance U.S. China relations, and we hope you'll come back and visit with us again at a future conference.
Well, David, thank you. You've asked a lot of good questions. I've enjoyed the opportunity to address these issues with your audience. Thank you, and thank you, John Crane, for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.